This is not a presentation on the technical points of navigation, but it's a presentation on leadership. It's a presentation on people. It's a presentation on the issue that you folks are dealing with, that you seem to be extraordinarily successful, and that's unity. Mao is a very disciplined ocean man. He requires that people on the canoe are the best of humankind. He was very concerned that this crew that was going to go on this voyage were not together. They weren't united. The day before the departure on May 1st, 1976 from Honolulu Bay, Maui, actually the day of, 2 hours before the departure, Mao brought a native speaker to come in to translate his words. And at the final ceremony, Mao stood up and spoke in his language and just said a few things. He said to all of us, crew members, he said, today we go to sea. Today, if you have any problem, you leave it on the land. Today, you come together. Today, when you get on the canoe, Hokulea is your mother. You take care of her, she'll take care of you. And today, I am your father. And you listen to my words, and you'll see the island you seek. Mao was concerned that on this canoe were two different communities. And they were both valid by their goals and their objectives. They were both valid, but they weren't together. They didn't find, even though they were different, they couldn't find common ground. One community was a community of the science community, National Geographic and other kinds of writers that were going to record this voyage, create movies and books, share it with the world about the great voyages of the Polynesians, and document Mao. Valid, important to be done, the record. The other half of the crew was the Hawaiian community. And their job was to protect Hokulea. Their job was to make sure it stayed Hawaiian. Their job was to make sure that it doesn't get taken away like everything else did in the past. So you had these two communities. Mao looked at them, and they're all human beings, all important pieces of the success of the voyage. But he was worried they didn't come together. Even though in their diversity, they didn't find those elements of respect and caring for each other. And Mao was very worried about that. This is another old slide. It's 3 days out on our epic voyage from Hawaii to Tahiti. Know that this is the first voyage in 600 years. So it was challenging. It was scary. And there was a lot of fear of the unknown. And she was heavily laden with a lot of weight. And there's 17 people on board. And to make a long story short, as sailors, they were powerful, they were extraordinary. They found Tahiti, 31 days at sea. This is going into Papeete Harbor. I was somehow selected to be on the second crew, the return crew. I flew down to Tahiti and would be part of taking Hokulea back home. And true story, there were so many Tahitians on the beach that we actually climbed those trees in the background. And it was like spontaneous, it was innate. These first peoples who still maintain their language, maintain their orations, remember the names of great canoes and great navigators and great captains, but they don't have it in their real lives anymore. Those stories become more mythical over time, and we forget over time how valuable they are to us. When Hokulea came into Tahiti, that canoe wasn't Hawaiian. That canoe was theirs, because it was both the symbol and the reality of the power of their ancestors. And it was a day that it invoked, I would say, enormous sense of pride and dignity to that ancestry. And it was overwhelming. So many children instinctually got up on the back of the canoe, climbing the rigging, that they actually started to sink the back of the canoe. And us guys had to go politely and humbly and in English ask them to get off so that we could take care of this thing we need to take care of our mother. And it changed all of us. All of a sudden, we're not isolated in Hawaii. We're now connected to this old nation to know that this is our ancestor, what we call ohana, what we call family. But let me just say, the journey wasn't easy. It was enormous challenges. It's very difficult. Mao, I never saw him in Tahiti. My father of the sea, I never saw him in Tahiti. He was taken into hiding. He left secretly on an Air New Zealand jet. He was supposed to sail back with us, take the canoe home. He was flown to Fiji, where he was put on a series of ships back to his island of Satawa. Mao left the second crew, us guys, an 8-track cassette tape. A lot of you guys don't even know what that is. With a recording on it, and he said a few things, but he said to the second crew, us guys, to the second crew, the first crew is no good. Maybe you're no good too. Then he said to Kimo, the guy he was staying with in Hawaii, he says, Kimo, send my clothes back home, and nobody from Hawaii come look for me. You'll never find me. And I was the youngest of the crew members, probably the least matured, and probably the one that was the most scared. That this dream of voyaging in Hokulea was powerful, but it was starting to get outweighed by fear. That for me to go deep sea on the canoe, fundamentally, I needed leadership I trusted. I needed leadership I trusted, and that leadership went on. And not understanding that you need to own your words, I started to project that fear by not being honest with myself to say you're afraid, but started to project it on leadership, tried to project it on others. And so I started talking about, Mao quit, maybe I'll quit too, and I'll go home. And one of our elders, one of our top big wave riders, his name is Wally Froyseth, who was down there repairing Hokulea and dry dock, hears this words of quitting and going home. And he hears it's coming from me. Finds me. We're staying in the youth hostel in Papeete. He comes and finds me, grabs me by the shirt, crying, yanks me to his face, and says, boy, you stop talking about quitting. Shoves me away. He says, you get on that canoe, you take her home because it's your time. Because it's your time. Make a decision. It's your time. And so I went, and I just thank Wally for the scolding that I needed to get on the canoe. This is us sailing home. Instead of 31 days, it was 23. Instead of all the stuff with the media and everything else, just a bunch of young men and women with the freedom to go and explore. We brought on professional, because of the absence of Mao, we brought on professional sailors, and we brought on instrument navigators. And we had an extraordinary journey home. The thing that will haunt us in time in this presentation, because the journey's not easy, we had no storm. So we were never really fully tested. But we did get home. And as powerful as Herb Connies' vision was to find Tahiti, his vision only saw one voyage. And I don't think anybody saw what was going to happen to our internal voyages. That So that ultimately in the end, there was only going to be one voyage, 1976. You're going to make these movies, you're going to make these books, and that's it. But the problem with that, for us young people, was on the voyage, in the wake of your ancestors, on the sea road of your ancestors, is how you find yourself. So if there are no other voyages, where do you go? You go back to nowhere. And we had to sail again. And this is where the journey gets really rough, because it wasn't easy. And the cost was huge. Remember, Mao said, "Don't come look for me, you're not going to find me." We weren't tested, but we needed to go. So we planned another voyage. We prepared Hokulea. We trained ourselves, and in hindsight, we didn't plan enough, we didn't train enough, and Hokulea wasn't ready. And that second voyage took place in March 16, 1978. And in hindsight, we weren't ready. And the big issue that was most unprepared was leadership. Leadership wasn't ready. We were going to be departing out of the Alawai Canal on the island of Oahu. There were thousands of people there, pray for you, love you, spouses, children, family, strangers. In the afternoon of that March 16th, it was strong winds, and leadership got up and said, fundamentally said, here's our choices. He said, today we'll leave. We don't need an escort boat for safety. And the only communication system we have to inform people on the shore is a single sideband radio that we haven't tested. And he said, if we don't contact you from sea, we'll call you from Tahiti in a month. We had no idea how dangerous those words were. We left at sunset, and we crossed into what we call the Molokai channel, the channel between Oahu and Molokai. It's extraordinarily dangerous when it's rough. Winds turn to gale, and we were unprepared. We couldn't keep the water out of the leeward hull, and the force of the waves were driving it down. And the seas were about maybe, they were big, maybe 12 feet. But we called them stacking waves, where the bigger wave travels faster than small waves. When it gets on top of small waves, they get very large. And around midnight, we couldn't keep the water out of one hull. We got inside the stacking wave, and the wave just picked Hokulea up and turned it right over. And we were, that one hull was completely submerged, and the only thing above sea level was about 3 feet of a keel on the other hull that had air trapped in it. And you had 14 crew members on top of that keel, and when the big waves came through, they kept knocking us off in north winds, gale, cold. And the question was, how many waves can you survive? Remember, if you don't hear from us, we'll call you from Tahiti. Nobody knew where we were. We were drifting south, certainly out of the shipping lanes between the islands, and clearly getting outside the flight paths of the normal air traffic, and we were in trouble. The other name that you should remember is this man. He was recognized internationally as the one who would surf the world's biggest waves. He was considered in Hawaii as Hawaii's top lifeguard, and that he was the first to be stationed at this beach called Waimea Bay on the north shore of Hawaii, where people find out how unforgiving the ocean is when you're unprepared in the wintertime. He was the first to be stationed there because he was the best. And I'll tell you his record. Had 500 people in trouble that he had to attempt to rescue, and he lost 0. His name is Aikau. His name is Aikau. Quiet man, powerful man. The thing about Eddie that I was so privileged to witness was that everybody in Hawaii knew him, not by what he said, but what he did. And everybody, I don't care age, from child to grandparent, it didn't matter what nationality you were, that Eddie was someone that was so loved because he was so respected, and he was Hawaiian. And the thing about him that was so crucial at the time was that he was heroic, but he was a real hero, not a fabricated one that you see on television. And he was Hawaiian, and young children of Hawaiian ancestry had the ability to look at someone and say, I can be proud because I know Eddie. And Eddie was a crew member in Hokulea on that voyage. This is a picture of a picture. And if you look on the left-hand side of behind Eddie's shoulder, you see that white strip. Eddie's sitting on a surfboard in the Alawai Canal a couple hours before we left on March 16th on that voyage. And he took that surfboard out of the water and went to the captain and said, I want to put the surfboard on Hokulea. I want to surf Tahiti. And the captain said, yes. So he tied it on. When the canoe flipped over, it fell off the canoe and it was rolling in the surf, and I swam out and got it because I thought we're going to need this board. Imagine that you're sitting on this keel, 14 of you in a line, it's gale force and windy, you can't hear what leadership is saying, but decisions are being made. That was midnight when the canoe was. Sunrise, you see Eddie talking to the captain. And the captain apparently says, you can't go. You stay on this canoe. And I don't know what happened. About 10 in the morning, you see crew member tying on a knitted bag around Eddie's waist. You see him putting oranges and bags of poi inside the net. You see him tying on a life jacket. And then jump in the water on the surfboard. Imagine that Molokai and the island of Lanai are at least 25 miles upwind. There was so much wind that we call it ehukai, that the waves break and create this band of salt on the horizon that it looks like fog. And I have good eyesight. I could barely see the tops of the mountains. Eddie's got bad eyesight. If you come to Hawaii, you see the bumper stickers said, and all these cars in Hawaii say, Eddie would go. You know, in many ways, Eddie had to go. On the obvious, it'd be that Eddie, every single cell in his body is engineered and trained to save people. I'm going to save these 14 people. That's the obvious. But I'll tell you a story about Eddie. 2 weeks before we left on the voyage, we were at the Honolulu Medical Group getting our inoculations and seeing whether we were fit enough to go. I didn't really know him that well, and I was so intimidated by him because he was so heroic that I really would approach him. And we were on the 4th floor of that medical group building, and by coincidence, we got in the elevator together. And you know, the elevator doors, when they close, some of them have that stainless steel bands where they close together. And I was in the elevator with Eddie, but he wasn't with me. He was very far away, and he was tapping that door. just tapping the door with his hand, thinking very deeply and far away. We get down to the lobby. Eddie walks out in front of me, leaves me, and then he walks a distance, turns around and goes, "You know, Nainoa, I gotta sail on Tahiti. I gotta go down the path. I gotta go pull Tahiti out of the sea. We gotta bring dignity and honor back to our elders and our ancestry. And then we gotta give it to children." Eddie knew better than anybody else how important the canoe was to well-being. He knew. So when he put that knitted bag on and he put the poi inside, he went to save the crew, but he went to save the hope and the possibility of healing for children. I jumped in the water, grabbed his arm, and asked him, "Are you making the right?" I didn't say that. I said, "Are you doing the right thing? Is he making the right decision?" Because I didn't like it, boy. Pulled his arm away, paddled off. The last thing I saw of Eddie was going over these big waves. Life jacket comes off, floating in the water. We were luckily rescued the next midnight by the Coast Guard. I got up in the chopper first, and my job was to go home and find out how Eddie's doing. We assumed, because we were rescued, that he made it. Imagine Honolulu Airport around 2 in the morning, landing into the black tarmac of South Ramp, Honolulu Airport, getting out, there's hundreds of people there. Media. Amongst and all of that was this big white van. It's the van of we call Mom and Pop Aikau, Eddie's parents. And not thinking the choices of my words, I walk into the van and I said, "Where's Eddie?" Thinking that he made it. I will never forget the sound of a Hawaiian elder wailing. She wailed and she wailed because Eddie didn't make it. And she cried through the night. The next day was the largest land and sea rescue operations in the history of Hawaii. It was reflective of the love of that man. There were the Coast Guard, the Civil Air Patrol, there were public and private helicopters. The Navy was out on the ocean. There was private small aircraft. There was boats out in gale force winds. There were people on every single island searching every inch of coastline. And we searched and we searched and we searched because that was all we could do. And it was dangerous. Mom and Pop's Aikau are quiet, humble people. But Pop's Aikau, Eddie's father, calls a press conference at his home. Everybody's there. And he gets up in front of all these cameras and he goes, "Stop. Everybody in Hawaii, you stop looking for my son." It's about 12 days after we search. The reason why I tell you stop, I don't want anybody else to get hurt. Leadership never recovered the trauma. Couldn't handle the pressure. Broken. Absent of vision, there was no hope. Broken. It was like lightning that hit us and broke us in half. Part of the community saying, just rebuild Hokulea, and let's just go back to Tahiti, do the same thing. Let's rescue Eddie's vision and his dream. But you ran the risk of somebody else being lost at sea because you can't do it. The other half of the community is saying, well, why don't we just take Hokulea out of the water, put it in the Bishop Museum, make it an exhibit so nobody gets hurt. But then there were those who were raising the question, well, if you do that, then how many generations are we going to have so our children can forget that the legacy of Hokulea, the hope of Hokulea, was tragedy? And the problem with that is by the larger society, that was expected because it was Hawaiian. We were nowhere. No one could stand up and lead. We were broken. Of all the things that we deal with in the trauma, I mean, it was just extraordinary. And I've never seen a society that was so deeply saddened. And that sense of saddenedness of that society was equal to how much they loved Eddie. And we just couldn't get up off the ground. And we needed new leadership. We needed leadership that had way more courage than we did. We needed leadership that understood how important it is to envision where you got to get to. And we needed leadership that understood the commitment to figure out how are you going to prepare yourself to get there. And it was 12 days after, I don't know, maybe 12 days, 2 weeks after Pops told us to stop. All I could do in all that trauma was to do what I do best, and that was to hide. That the biggest burden for me was the issue of shame. So I spent all by myself. So I'd go in the ocean daytime by myself. Nighttime, I'd spend looking at the stars, never to dream that I would ever navigate again. That dream was gone. But the stars were just good friends. And then we needed new leadership. And the leadership, I would humbly say, and very proudly say, it was this man. It's my father.